Euro happies?
This graph shows that after the Second World War, the income of the average European has gotten closer and closer to that of the average American in dollar terms. However, after the crisis of 2008, that picture has changed. As Europeans,
it's funny that Europeans don't know that we made up the entire housing crisis to fuck over their economies and like pull ahead. They all think 2008 is real. We made it. We made the whole fucking thing up. Housing crisis? What does it even mean, dude? It's just a house. We made The Big Short fake movie. The whole fucking thing is a total hoodwink to fuck over their economies and diverge. Don't tell them, bro. They haven't figured it out by now. Come on, like the joke's over. It's been 20 years.
Incomes stagnated while that of Americans continued to rise. This has led to alarming reports by financial media that Europeans are getting poorer and Americans richer. And while some of that can be explained by Europeans working less, a new report by arguably Europe's most famous economist, Mario Draghi, claims that the main problem is that Europeans have become 20% less productive compared to Americans. This economic stagnation is a major threat to Europe's prosperity because it will prevent European governments from making much needed investments to deal with a rapidly aging population and increased outside threats. However, as a European economist who acknowledges that this chart is very real, I still had a nagging suspicion that a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing, because whenever I make videos about Western economies, it's usually the Americans that are complaining about the state of their economy, not Europeans. Of course, me just looking at my comments is hardly scientific. But when I inspected typical quality of life statistics, such as the Human Development Index, life expectancy at birth, and
life expectancy is where America looks like a fucking third world nation.
Such as the Human Development Index, life expectancy at birth.
We had such bad health care for regular people, and we have deaths of despair and fentanyl, and dude, our life expectancy is miserable for the amount of wealth in the country. It's embarrassing. Look at this fall off, dude. It's crazy.
And self-reported happiness, which normally correlate consistently with GDP per person, this supposed massive impoverishment of Europeans versus Americans does not show up.
Is that huge drop Fent? That's part of it.
A massive impoverishment of Europeans versus Americans does...
the thoughts are covered, but I think this is around 2018. Probably in COVID response, rising fentanyl. Yeah, I'm sure this is COVID, right? This is COVID because there's a lot of deaths.
Massive impoverishment of Europeans versus Americans does not show up at all. This really got me wondering, what's going on? Did Europeans find the secret to having a good life without having money?
This is happy Europeans?
No, the problem is that using this specific measure of GDP that almost everyone uses is very misleading, at least when it comes to comparing how rich Europeans are to Americans. To understand why, let's do a quick review of how economists compare economies. While economists have long been looking for an alternative, as of today, gross domestic product, or GDP for short, is still considered the best metric to compare how well off people in different countries are. In essence, GDP measures the value of all final goods and services produced in a specific country or region in a year. Now, while that misses a lot of economic activity, GDP actually tends to correlate really well with all sorts of different quality of life metrics.
Sure.
But while, for example, life expectancy in terms of years lived can easily be compared between two countries, GDP cannot, because countries often use a different unit of account for GDP. That is, the value of British goods and services are measured in British pounds. And while the Europeans mostly use euros and Americans use dollars. Of course, the easiest way to compare economies that use different currencies is to just use today's exchange rate to, for example, convert Euro GDP to Europe's dollar GDP. Indeed, this is exactly how this graph was produced by economists at the World Bank. And just to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, when I compare economies on this channel, I most often use GDP in dollar terms, simply because the US dollar is the world currency. So if your GDP drops in terms of US dollars, your citizens have genuinely become poorer from a global perspective. That is, they can now buy less stuff on international markets. So if, for example, we want to compare the international power of two small open economies that trade a lot with each other in different currencies, dollar term GDP is, in my opinion, the best metric that we have. However, GDP measured in US dollars is less useful if we want to compare American incomes to those in Europe.
Yeah.
You see, in such a large economic blocks, only a small fraction of goods and services are actually traded across borders. For example, in the US, total imports were just 15% of GDP in 2022. On top of that, for many goods and services, transportation costs are so high that it is extremely difficult to trade them across borders, even if such products or services would be much cheaper in a neighboring country. For example, if I go to the local hairdresser here in Belgium, I pay 15 euros to get this specific haircut, and it is worth every penny in my opinion. Which is good because, well...
I'm sorry, really? I'm not making fun of him, but it's certainly not like a top tier greatest haircut I've ever seen. This is like a haircut I would get. That's my haircut? Yeah, it's very similar. And I don't think I'm getting every penny's worth of, I guess 15 euros. 15 euros is probably like, 10 cents, right? 15 euros is like, I think that's worth one gumball in America. So yeah, that makes sense. That's actually, that's valuable.
I live fairly close to the Dutch border. Traveling to the nearest Dutch hair salon would be way more expensive than 15 euros, especially if I take into consideration travel time. This is why economists often use getting a haircut as an example of a non-tradable good or service, where transportation costs are so high.
Dude, imagine being a European riding your bike next to a wind farm. When you could be riding your fucking SUV down the 405, dude, next to a Walmart, like a real human being in a real economy. One lane, embarrassing. It's like watching cavemen, dude, chisel with rocks.
To consideration travel time. This is why economists often use getting a haircut as an example of a non-tradable good or service, where transportation costs are so high that international trade does not make sense at all. As you can imagine, the bigger a country or region is, the fewer goods and services will be tradable, as it gets more and more expensive to travel to another country for an alternative. Specifically, economists have estimated that non-tradable goods and services could be as low as 22% for a big country like the United States.
Okay.
In other words, while it may be simplest to use today's dollar-euro exchange rate to judge how rich Europeans are compared to Americans, the vast majority of the GDP of both regions is not directly impacted by this exchange rate because it is measuring mostly non-tradable goods and services. This is why instead economists often use the so-called
This is such a long cope. 25-minute setup to say that, on purchasing power parity, it's closer. Yeah, I'm sure it is. You said at the beginning.
Purchasing power parity, or PPP for short, exchange rates, to compare the economies of big currency blocks like Europe and the United States. In essence, the purchasing power parity comparison of GDP looks at the prices of a representative basket of goods and services that includes both tradable and non-tradable goods and services. So PPP GDP compares the purchasing power that people actually have to buy most goods and services in their own country, rather than on international markets using the US dollar. Interestingly, if we use PPP GDP to compare European incomes to those of Americans, we will see that Europe is not falling behind where it really matters. Indeed, as you can see here, while the average EU and UK citizens' share of PPP GDP is lower than that of the average American, who works longer hours by the way, we do not see the same stagnation as we saw in the US dollar GDP graph. But why this difference? Well, since the difference between US dollar GDP...
Bro, all I have to say, there's still a fucking big ass gap. Maybe it's a little wider, but yeah, it's not as bad though. Well, it's not that it's not as bad, it's that this didn't flatline in the post-COVID, which I guess makes sense, I was always suspicious of that idea. He's probably going to explain. Actually, this is the explanation I really want to hear, because it probably has to do with the exchange rates and the strength of the dollar or whatever since COVID that makes the first GDP number unreliable.
Same stagnation as we saw in the US dollar GDP graph. But Why this difference? Well, since the difference between US dollar GDP and purchasing power parity GDP comes from how they account for both prices and the exchange rate, we would expect that either Europe's inflation and or exchange rate compared to the US could explain why Europeans have gotten poorer in US dollar terms since 2008. And as you can see here, after the 2008 crisis, prices in the US have gone up considerably faster than in key European countries.
Yikes!
However, as we can see here, for the case of, for example, the Turkish lira, a high inflation currency should lose value compared to a low inflation currency. So given that inflation was consistently higher in the US than in Europe, we'd expect the dollar to have lost value compared to the euro. However, if we look at this graph, we can see that instead, the low inflation euro has lost value to the high inflation dollar. While in 2008 you could roughly get $1.50 for 1 euro,
Yeah, that's exchange rates.
today you can only get roughly $1.12 for that same single euro. So while this graph is correct, Europeans are poorer in dollar terms, most Europeans have not really felt this because most of what they buy are so-called non-traded goods and services which come from the continent itself.
So we printed more dollars than they printed euros, made more stupid financial decisions, but the strength of our US dollar has carried us.
Where they do not use US dollars. This can explain why quality of life metrics that usually correlate with GDP, like the Human Development Index, life expectancy and reported happiness in Europe, are doing just fine despite dollar value GDP stagnating massively compared to the US since 2008. But then, why are financial newspapers and politicians making such a fuss about Europe's economic decline? Well, I think it is mostly a matter of perspective. If you work for an international company, as a financial journalist, for example, you will genuinely feel poorer on your trips to the United States or when comparing yourself to your American colleagues. And if, like Mario Draghi...
Dude, it's also tourism. Like, if you live in Europe and you start to see an influx of American tourists who can spend more than you think is reasonable. This is happening in Japan, dude. They're getting pissed off because their exchange rate's so bad. There's so many tourists, not just from America, but from all over. And they seem relatively wealthier. And it's like, they're pissed. They're like, what the fuck's going on with our economy?
You are worried about Europe's place in the world that is rapidly becoming more hostile.
Spain too.
Dollar GDP also matters a lot. For example, Europe's new LNG energy imports will have to be paid for in US dollars. Finally, the fact that the dollar has remained so strong despite higher inflation could be a reflection of fundamental US strengths compared to Europe, such as its cheaper energy, younger population, and better business environment for the companies of the future. So yes, people are right to worry about Europe's diminished economic strength on the world stage. However, with this video, I've hoped to have convinced you that despite a popular narrative, Europeans have not gotten